To be frank with you, I'm here to talk about something today that has kept me awake at night many times. The more I have thought about this, the more I have become convinced that it is a grave moral emergency. And I really wish that wasn't the case. You know, it would be a great comfort to me if I were to find that my worries were misplaced here. I would very much like to be proven wrong. So before I begin, I should point out that this talk does contain distressing information and footage. I'll give another warning before I show any footage, but I really can't emphasize enough how awful some of this stuff is. Now, talking of distressing content, here is a photo of me in my teenage years. As you can imagine, I was late to the game when it came to dating. I didn't have my first romantic relationship until I was already 19. And so, rather than learning through experience in my awkward teenage years, I, in part, learned about romantic relationships passively from what I saw on television. And I think this led to some very unrealistic expectations, because in movies, well, people fall in love at first sight. And you can see my problem. Nobody's going to fall in love at first sight with me. And when they eventually get together in the movie, they live happily ever after, and then the movie ends. But as soon as I started having relationships, it didn't play out like a Disney movie. But you see, Disney wasn't only responsible for my idyllic view of romance. It also gave me an idyllic view of something else. Nature. When it comes to the natural world, we tend to think Mother Nature knows best. But let's be real for a minute. Okay, sometimes Mother Nature doesn't have the best ideas. Have you ever seen a cat's penis? No? Just me? Well, it's your lucky day, because I brought a photo of one. A cat's penis has spikes, making sex painful for female cats. So on behalf of the female cats all over the world, thanks a lot, Mother Nature. And if Mother Nature really does know best, how come for female hyenas going through their first pregnancy, around 60% of cubs suffocate to death in their mother's birth canal? It can sound intuitive to say that natural things are good. But then you realize that earthquakes are natural, that malaria is natural, that it's natural for children to get cancer. Now, don't get me wrong. Aesthetically speaking, I love being in nature. I enjoy seeing beautiful sunsets and landscapes. But I think there's another side to nature that tends to escape our awareness. And I think it's hard to relate to many of the hardships that animals face in nature. They have to deal with things like starvation, untreated disease, predation, parasites, harsh weather conditions, wildfires and droughts. And what happens when a wild animal falls and breaks their leg? Nature is far from perfect for the ones who live in it. Did you know that some species of turtle can lay over 2,000 eggs in their lifetime? 2,000. Can you imagine if they all survived and reproduced themselves? Well, we would see explosions in the population sizes of turtles, but we don't. If a population remains stable, only 2 of those 2,000 will survive to adulthood and reproduce themselves. The rest will die. And this reproductive strategy of having lots of offspring without investing parental care That's the predominant strategy we see in nature, which means far from the idyllic view, the vast majority of wild animals are dying shortly after being born. Perhaps that wouldn't make a good Disney movie. I want to tell you about a German wildlife photographer called Michael Polizer. Now, he loves nature. Here he is taking a photo of some meerkats. And I've noticed that he tends to increase the saturation in his photos to really bring out their beauty. But there was one photo where he decided to decrease the saturation, even blurring the image to make it less visible. Michael visited a nature park and found a baby elephant who had become trapped in the mud and abandoned by her parents. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been for her? Well, that was just the beginning. A pack of hyenas found this baby elephant who was unable to move and began to eat her alive, starting from the end of the trunk. In fact, by the time Michael arrived at the scene, well, they'd already eaten the entire trunk. Yet still, she was alive, struggling. Well, of course, Michael pleaded with the park ranger. Do something. End this misery and euthanize the baby elephant. But the park had a rule. They didn't allow intervention. We only observe. 2 hours later, the hyenas had eaten her eyes and skinned her skull completely. Yet still, she was alive, continuously crying for help. And at that point, the park ranger was finally convinced. He went against the rules of the park and euthanized the baby elephant. Our romanticization of nature causes us to vastly underestimate the suffering that wild animals endure. In fact, had Mother Nature been a real parent, well, she'd be in jail for child abuse. You see, there is a perspective that always seems to be missing from our conversations about wild animals and nature. I recently saw an advert from a wildlife charity that was raising concern for the number of sea turtles in existence. So the number of the species are low, and they want a world where the species are thriving. Implication being, of course, that if the number of the species were comparatively high, then they would be thriving. And that sounds reasonable on its surface, I think. But if a species being large in number means they are thriving, then who could be happier than factory farm chickens? When I entered a British chicken farm, I entered a shed with over 40,000 birds inside. And I came across this one bird who had tipped upside down and was unable to turn back over. And as I continued to walk through the shed, I found the remains of more birds who tipped upside down like that, and had just died that way, possibly from being unable to reach the water. Now, at the level of the species, sure, you might say they're thriving. I mean, they're certainly not endangered. They might be the most successful conservation effort in the history of human civilization. But there's another perspective. A more important one. When you zoom in to the perspective of the individual, well, I don't need to tell you. They're not doing very well at all. You see, a species can't suffer. An ecosystem can't suffer. The individual is the one who can. And yet so often, when we talk of wild animals, it's as if they only matter insofar as they contribute to the flourishing of a species or the balance of an ecosystem. Well, today I'm here to talk about the animals whom even vegans forget. Because just as the inside of a slaughterhouse is out of sight to most people, the suffering of wild animals is similarly invisible to most of us. It's common to think that farmed animals make up the majority of animals on Earth, but that is not true. There are around 8 billion humans alive on Earth today, and big numbers are really hard for us to wrap our heads around. So to help us out, let's put this on a number line, where we say 8 billion equates to around 1 inch or the width of a 10-pence coin. So if we stacked up the entirety of the human population, we would get a line about 1 inch long. There are around 100 billion animals alive on factory farms at any given moment. That would equate to around 14 inches or the width of a laptop. By the way, 100 billion is around the same ballpark as the total number of humans who have ever lived. If we add wild vertebrates, vertebrates are animals with a backbone, like birds, mammals, reptiles, and fish, we get a further 10 trillion, which would equate to around 100 feet long, or the length of a basketball court. Okay, let's just stop there for a second. Imagine standing on one side of a basketball court, underneath the net, and trying to spot on the other side of the court a 10-pence coin that's been placed on the floor. That coin represents the entire number of human lives being lived right now. And everything in between you and that coin represents the number of individual vertebrates living in the wild who we know are aware of their lives. The number of sentient individuals out there is mind-boggling. If we were to add wildland arthropods, which includes insects like bees and ants, we would get a further 100,000 trillion. And at this point, it is just not possible for our evolved brains to truly comprehend the number of animals out there. On our number line, that would take us from London to Snowdonia. But even without the arthropods, there is no doubt the vast majority of sentient minds on this planet are wild animals. The question, what is it like to live on Earth? And the question, what is it like to be a typical wild animal? Statistically speaking, they're the same questions. Let's leave the numbers alone for now and just consider how we feel about farmed animals. I think it's so easy to lose track of the urgency of even their situation. So let's just remind ourselves that as I speak these words, somewhere out there is a pig screaming in a gas chamber. It's not our fault, of course, but we understand that that's of no consolation to the one in the chamber. And when we really think about it, we realize that regardless of where it's happening, and regardless of the cause, the experience of these animals matters. It sure as hell matters to them. But I think one of the special things that brings us all together is that it matters to us too. Now, when it comes to wild animals, we might still have this intuition that humans aren't responsible for the suffering we don't cause, and that trying to help wild animals would be attempting to play God. Well, as animal advocates, we try to reject speciesism. So let's take this moment to reflect upon ourselves and see if we're holding this view consistently. Because do we have that same attitude towards humans in need? No. When it comes to humans, we're very clear. Our responsibilities extend beyond simply not harming them. I mean, just imagine if I tried to justify leaving this child to starve because we shouldn't play God, or because it's natural. It's the circle of life. When the insects consume the child's remains, that contributes to the biodiversity and balance of the ecosystem. How repugnant this sounds in the context of our species. Speciesism can be defined as a prejudice or bias against those who don't belong to a certain species. And if we reject speciesism, as I think we should, it seems that we shouldn't have a totally different attitude towards helping non-humans suffering from similar harms. Now, we might be tempted to brush this concern off. After all, it would be comforting to us if wild animals were happy most of the time. But natural selection selects for the replication of genes, not the well-being of individuals. And these two things aren't even remotely similar, which is why we have cats with barbed penises. It's why mothers will sometimes abandon the runts of the litter. And it's why lions will eat the babies of other lions. As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins once said, the total amount of suffering in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. But even if I'm wrong, even if it were true that wild animals were happy most of the time, that doesn't mean we shouldn't help them when they're not. Someone may also object by saying we shouldn't infringe upon a wild animal's autonomy to live how they want, even if we're trying to help. But this assumes that wild animals aren't already having their autonomy infringed upon. Wild animals are frequently having their autonomy thwarted when they're starving, but there's no food, or when they're dying slowly and painfully from a disease, or when they're being harmed by another animal. It seems strange to only care about whether humans are infringing upon the autonomy of another animal, but not to care about the animal's autonomy in and of itself. We may also be tempted to reflect on our own experience and say, look, I choose to do things that harm me. I chose to drink alcohol, knowing I might be hungover. I chose to go rock climbing, knowing I might fall. Forgetting that no wild animal chooses to be slowly eaten alive by parasites. No elephant chooses to die of starvation when their teeth fall out in old age. Our choices to undergo voluntary suffering for our recreational activities does not justify leaving animals to suffer and die when they're in need. So what is it that I'm saying here? Am I saying that we should take to the forests with our guns and start shooting predators? Well, firstly, while predation is often the first thing that comes to mind when we consider the suffering in nature, there are many other forms of suffering, and I hope I'm making that clear. So even if it were true that nothing could be done about predation, that wouldn't therefore mean that nothing could be done about wild animal suffering. Secondly, to acknowledge the problem of predation isn't to say that predators are morally responsible for the suffering they cause. But a lack of malice on the cat's part provides no relief to the tormented mouse. But no, I am not saying that we should start killing predators. We couldn't even say with any certainty that doing so would lead to a reduction in suffering overall. What I am saying is that we should take wild animal suffering seriously and invest resources into learning about how we might be able to help them in the future. Now, someone could be thinking, just look at humanity's track record when it comes to intervening in nature, that we tend to mess things up. And I agree that we should be extremely cautious. But I don't think it's fair to look at previous interventions where the goal wasn't even to help individual wild animals, and to conclude from those interventions that helping wild animals is impossible. Impossible now and forever into the future. That the way things happen to be on planet Earth right now also happens to be the optimal state that we can achieve for wild animal well-being. We need to do the research. Perhaps you're thinking, look, I get it, wild animals are suffering and it does matter, but surely the issue here is that ecosystems are just so complicated and interconnected that surely any attempts to improve things would lead to many unforeseen circumstances and will probably just make things worse. And I think that's an understandable perspective to have. But just imagine if we had that same fatalistic attitude towards human suffering. Because in the 18th century, people could have said, interfering in the human body is a silly idea that should be forgotten. Well, the human body is so complicated and interconnected that surely any attempts to improve things will just make things worse. Instead, we decided to use science to learn about the human body, and over many years of research, discovered ways that we can reliably make things better. Similarly, there is a new field of study called welfare biology that is getting off the ground, where researchers are attempting to learn about the lives of wild animals so that one day we might make a significant difference in their lives too. Now, of course, it is extremely early days, but to give you an idea of the sorts of things that might be promising in the future, the New World screwworm is a parasitic fly that lays its eggs into the open wounds of warm-blooded animals, like birds and mammals. And it's called a screwworm because the larvae are screw-shaped, and they drill down into living flesh, devouring it. And we know this is incredibly painful to experience because humans are warm-blooded animals who become infected. And when a human is infected with this, the standard procedure is to give them morphine immediately so a surgeon can just cut the things out of them right away, because it's that unbelievably agonizing. Estimates suggest that roughly 1 billion animals are dying this way every year. We also know that we can potentially eradicate it from many ecosystems without disastrous effects, because we've already eradicated it from North America. To give you another idea, we successfully eradicated rabies from Europe by dropping food from helicopters that contained an oral vaccine. In doing this, we spared thousands of animals from experiencing that torturous disease. Now, we did this for anthropocentric reasons, because humans were at risk of becoming infected, as well as farmed animals. But in theory, such vaccinations could be extended to all animals who need them. And let's not forget that there are many individuals out there who are helping wild animals today. Here's an example from a wildfire.
You want to put them in the blanket and bring them out of the hot stuff?
Just let me get this broom. And All right. We'll get going in a second.
But I think even more crucially, our ability to shape the world today would sound like magic to the humans who lived 200 years ago. We don't know what will or won't be possible in the future. It could come to be that humanity's ability to shape the world in 200 years would sound like magic to the very humans in this room. Or maybe things won't progress that much. We don't know. But what we do know is that if we turn a blind eye to their suffering, then it won't matter what we can potentially do, because we'll miss their perspective and won't even see a problem. Despite this, we may still have this intuition to say that wild animals are just separate from us, and it's not our place to try and change things in nature. Forgetting, of course, that we already are, inevitably, changing things in nature. Whether it's from anthropogenic climate change, or agriculture, or the cities we build, the world is constantly being altered by human existence, changing the experience of wild animals on every inch of this planet. The question is no longer, should we or should we not change things in nature? We already are, all the time, and it's inescapable. The question we are left with is, how do we want to change things? It's which ethical principles should guide how we continue to change things. We can continue to ignore the experience of wild animals as if that individual perspective doesn't exist or doesn't matter, that they only matter instrumentally because biodiversity and ecosystems affect our lives. Or we can acknowledge their experience, recognize that each individual matters for their own sake, and we can decide to spread the idea of compassion for all animals. I want to show you a short video that illustrates some of the things that wild animals are dealing with. And I know this kind of thing can be very hard to watch, but there's just a sense in which talking about the issue, as I have been doing, doesn't do the animals justice. I completely understand if you decide to turn away or even leave the room for the next few minutes. But my hope is that you'll choose to resist that urge and bear witness with me.
The problem is that the absence of rain means grasses and other essential plants are not growing, and the animals that depend on them are dying from a lack of nutrition. Since the start of June, almost 60 elephant deaths have been recorded. More than half were calves killed by starvation because due to a lack of sustenance, their mothers stopped producing milk.
The storm is now subsiding, but not all the elephants have been so lucky. One youngster has got lost. Thirsty and exhausted, it follows the tracks of its mother, but sadly, in the wrong direction.
Can you move back?
It will not be long before the storm claims its first victims. It's 3 days older than the other chick and has always won the race for food and attention.
this problem is as complicated as it is terrible. I'm not saying we have all the answers, but I am saying we need to talk about it. We need to raise awareness and get their perspective on the table. And my hope is that you'll choose to be someone who helps others in the animal movement to leave this blind spot behind. Because when we're faced with the reality of wild animal suffering, we realize that standing idle in the face of such urgent cries for help is not okay. Because deep down, we already know it doesn't make a difference if an animal is in a house, a factory farm, or a forest. Their suffering matters. It matters to them, and it should matter to us too. Thank you.